right away.
Okay. I'll go on mute again.
Okay, cool. Hello, everyone. Welcome to my podcast for women who want to build a successful career or a business through unlocking their unique value. Today, I'm sharing with you an episode on a very important topic that I know a lot of people in the corporate world are still struggling with. I'm talking about feedback. And for that conversation, I have invited a wonderful expert who herself grew up internationally, studied social psychology, and then got an MBA. She worked internationally with HR for Alliance, which is an international financial service provider in Munich, supporting Central and Eastern European regional HR team for a talent management perspective. She moved abroad to Singapore to work with the executives of Korn Ferry. She specialized in C-suite assessments and feedback development. Now, she's back in Germany, self-employed as a talent management consultant, assessment expert, and recently became executive coach, graduated from the Academy of Executive Coaching. So please welcome Eleana Ankel. Hi, Eleana. How are you today?
Hi, Luba. Thank you. I'm doing well. Thank you for the introduction. I'm happy to be here.
Wonderful. It's really great to have you in my podcast. I am sure you have tons of knowledge and experience that you can share, and I am really looking forward to hear from you those insights. Let me dive into my first question. What is feedback at work? And is every comment a piece of feedback?
I mean, that's a great way to jump in, just to get an overarching idea. Look, I think overarchingly, a very simple definition of feedback is probably any shared constructive input that helps an individual understand how their behavior or performance is perceived by others. So what is their impact at work? Okay, let's just kind of frame it that way quite generally. And feedback can occur in a formal setting as well as in an informal setting. And in formal settings, I mean, I think what comes to mind there right away is a performance evaluation discussion that you have with your line manager, right? That's a form of feedback. It is a formal form of feedback, and usually that's quite top down. It's given to you by your direct manager. And then you also have more informal feedback, which is kind of, in the moment, real time, spontaneous. And that can also be on a peer level. It can be, from your own direct reports, as well as people maybe that are external that you're working with. And I think that's where feedback really also very much depends, obviously, on the feedback culture of an organization. But no, not every comment is a piece of feedback, I would say. It is specifically in regards to an individual's impact at work, I would say.
Great, right. It's great to hear that. What would you say? So feedback is part of the working culture. You have to give it. You also should be able to receive it. It's part of the working relationships for every company. And would you say is the most important rule to give and receive feedback? Some best practices maybe from your experience that you can share.
Sure. I think so. Overarchingly, I would say this is, for me personally, the most important is feedback has to be honest and it has to be helpful. Obviously also framed in a respectful manner.
Helpful for who?
Helpful for the individual receiving it.
All right.
Yes, absolutely. And for that to come true, that means 1, the recipient must understand the feedback that is given. 2, the recipient must be able to also accept it. And 3, the recipient must be able to do then something about it. So it has to be specific, it has to be balanced, it has to be actionable. Those I think are probably the most important rules overarchingly of feedback.
So that's basically what I'm hearing you saying, is that if you're giving feedback, make sure that you are giving specific feedback. This feedback is helpful to that person to change or to improve and make sure that the person understands that feedback and accepts that, right? So you need to think about those things. On the receiving end, like what should a person do when a person is receiving this feedback?
So, I mean, all of this obviously is very contextual. And again, is it a formal form of feedback or more of an informal form of feedback? I think, would you like to dive into specifically one of those situations, or?
Yeah, that
or
would be great. Yeah.
I mean, I think something that I get asked a lot, as an executive coach also is, oh, I have this feedback session coming up and I'm not really sure how to prepare for it. What should I do?
Yeah.
And it is interesting. I do think feedback always brings up quite a lot of emotion in people ahead of time. It can make people very nervous. And I think just from a mindset perspective, what I have found to be very useful for people is to already get in this frame of mind of feedback is not personal. It's not about who you are as a person. It's about your impact at work. And ideally also that is how it's delivered to you. All of this is assuming the person is giving you feedback is doing a good job at giving you feedback, right? So that's rule number one. Go in with the mindset, this is not personal, this is about work and my impact at work. And linked to that, try to get into kind of a growth mindset of, I'm going to hear some things that I'm doing well, and I'm going to hear some things that I can improve on. Okay. And all of that is good for my development. So I need to make sure I take as much away from this conversation as possible.
Mm-hmm.
What that means is sit down for a moment and actually reflect on, how do you think you've done? What do you think your performance is like at the moment? Really get into a good mindset of awareness in that moment before going into one of those conversations.
Mm-hmm.
2, make sure you are clear on the questions that you want to bring to a conversation like this. And I say that because I do think these kind of formal feedback conversations are a great opportunity for you to get some clarity on what are my goals in terms of my personal development and in terms of my career, and what do I need some clarity on in terms of how do I get there? Because the person you're having this conversation is your manager, and they're partly responsible for that. So that's the second thing. And you know what? If you are insecure about any parts of your performance prior to the conversation, make sure you kind of ask around, ask your peers, ask some of the other managers, in regards to, how have I been doing? Is there anything that you'd like to already share with me ahead of my conversation, so that you're aware of those things? You can complement whatever you're going to be hearing from your manager with those kind of conversations that you've had. Those are probably the top 3 tips that I would give in terms of preparing for a more formal feedback conversation.
These are really great tips. Thank you for sharing them, because I almost wanted to jump in and say, people just get a pen and a piece of paper and write them down. But I'll just maybe try to summarize it real quick. First is basically, do not take it personally. So go into this feedback conversation with the mindset that it's not about you as a person, good or bad, and things like this. It is about your performance and your impact that you bring to the company. That's what will be discussed and assessed and discussed with your line manager. So that's the main idea that you should keep in mind when you go into that conversation, right?
Absolutely. Have the growth mindset linked to that. Like this can be used for good.
Yeah.
Might not always be easy to hear. There's some things that are going to make me uncomfortable, but overall, the purpose of this conversation is for me to grow and develop.
Right. And then you said you can make a list of things that you want to discuss, make a list of your goals. And you can also ask in advance your colleagues as well. Maybe they have already some feedback they can share with you, and that will help you. Maybe that will highlight already some things that will also show up in a feedback conversation.
Yep. And I would say also, most importantly, actually just take even if it's just 10 minutes to sit down and reflect on your own performance, to really get into that mindset of self-awareness. I think that really helps.
Yeah, that's a really great advice. Absolutely. So what do you think? I mean, you said that a lot of your clients are coming to you with a request to help them prepare for a feedback session because they feel uncomfortable, they're nervous to go into that conversation. Why do you think, what is the reason that they are nervous about it?
I'm not really sure, and it's hard to generalize that, but I can speak from my own experience personally, which is, I did initially have some issues with well, not issues, but I was nervous around any time I was receiving feedback. Obviously, there's a component of that is linked to some kind of insecurity internally. But I do also think that maybe even in school or university, there's a lot of opportunities that I don't think are taken early on in our education system where we get normalized around feedback. I think that you come into this big bad organization where you're trying to, imagine you're just starting your job, you're trying to keep up with everyone. There's a lot to learn, and all of a sudden there's all of these experts and people that you see as knowing more than you giving you feedback, and that can be very intimidating if you haven't previously been desensitized to that, if you haven't previously been taught that's okay and it's normal. I think every human being is afraid of making mistakes. No one wakes up in the morning saying, oh, I really want to be wrong today. It doesn't work that way. We are wired to want to be right. And so putting ourselves in situations where, that in that moment may not be the case can be initially uncomfortable.
Right. Yeah, that's very nice of you to share your personal perspective, your own experience. And I wanted to add a little bit of my own thoughts into this. I think that people who are nervous going into a feedback conversation with their line manager, they could be nervous that they're unprepared, that they don't know how to lead this conversation. That can give you the stress. But if you are prepared and if you are in the right mindset, but still you are uncomfortable about this conversation, I think it's an indication that you are a person who actually cares, that you care, that you will, and especially when you get some negative feedback and you get upset about it, or you feel uncomfortable and you start thinking, oh yeah, how to improve it, I want to change it. That means that you care about this feedback, you take it close to your heart, and that's actually a good sign. I would not like to have a person in my team who would say, I don't care about your feedback. I don't, there's nothing I want to take from it. There's nothing I want to learn or improve. That would be totally a horrible situation. So yeah, for me, in a way, it's a sign that it's a person who deeply cares about his or her work. And if things are not going right, they take it close to heart. So in that sense, for a person who gives feedback, I think there should be a high level of sensitivity of how you are giving this feedback to someone, and what impact it might have on that person.
Absolutely.
What do you think about that?
No, absolutely. And I think that goes back to what I said initially is, in my opinion, the most important thing about feedback is that when you are giving feedback, you need to be honest, respectful, and helpful. That really, the intention has to come from that place when you're giving feedback. And part of that also means, actually, when you're giving feedback, make sure you're focusing on observable actions, observable impact. Make sure you can actually give examples, make sure you can provide context, and make sure you never talk about someone as a person and the personality. Even if, even if the feedback is, okay, let's say hypothetically, there's an individual in the organization and you as a line manager you've been hearing some voices that this individual can be a bit rude and cut people off and is not very collaborative, okay? And there's obviously parts of that would be easy to play on personality in a feedback conversation. It's tempting to just play that back. But even in those situations, there is the opportunity to take that and make it more into an observable action. So, there has been some feedback that the mannerisms with which you communicate can have the impact that X, Y, Z, can have the impact that people, are scared to take ownership, or I don't know, all of these things that go around it. That already is much less on you as a person and much more about your communication style, which again is a skill, right?
Right. Yeah. And then you say at the end, both should agree on actions to improve it, right?
Definitely, definitely. I mean, what's the point of a feedback conversation? What's the point if someone just throws a bunch of observations at you? Okay, sure, they were able to give you details, but then it's like, all right, so what now what? Like, what's the deal? That's not the point of a feedback conversation. It has to be actionable. Absolutely. So you are there as a feedback provider to offer support and to say, look, let's put one or two things in place that will help you get on a good road with this, and then we can check back in again. Checking back in to seeing how people have progressed is an absolute sign of I care about your development. I gave you this feedback and it wasn't always easy, but I care about you and your development. So let's make sure we check in a month from now, 2 months from now, I don't know, however many times that you agree on together.
Right. And that brings me to the next question about following up and checking ins. What is the recommended frequency to have this kind of feedback conversations?
I mean, this is also very person dependent, right? So this is actually something, obviously you're going to have, I guess, annual, biannual performance evaluation. So formal feedback structures will always be in place. How often you want to have more informal feedback conversations is up to you and up to the culture that you want to create within the team. You have people who say, look, we want to make sure we're giving okay, so here's an example, right? In the consulting industry, you get feedback every time you have finished a project. That's also semi-formal, I would say. It's kind of expected. You have organizations where, it's common to, at the end of the call, give the feedback of, oh, I really found that very helpful. Thank you for doing XYZ. I would appreciate if you could continue doing that. That's a form of feedback. That's a form of feedback, and it's informal and casual. I wouldn't say there's a recommended amount. I would say what is recommended is that you have a clear strategy for yourself and for your team, and you communicate that. So whether you want a culture of more formality or more informality, that is something to align on with your team.
Right, right. And have you noticed in your work experience any difference between the generations, how they see feedback and how often do they want to have it, and what kind of preferences they have in terms of receiving and giving feedback?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to note that generational differences are obviously generalized. And of course, you'll have individual with specific behaviors across all generations. But there is some research showing that there are different preferences. So the so-called boomers and Gen X kind of prefer more goal-oriented feedback, face-to-face feedback, feedback that is in clear, smaller chunks that are actionable and that can be moved with in a structured manner. So very like matter of fact, here it is, let's move on. Millennials actually seem to prefer more regular, continuous feedback, a bit more informal, and actually also prefer more of a coaching and developmental approach rather than a matter-of-fact approach.
Right, and they want it like on a more
regular
frequent basis, like almost daily or weekly, like in small doses. I mean, every
yes, seemingly it seems that way, and also as part of that, actually also desire more of a balanced approach, so more positive reinforcement as well. And I think what's linked to that, interestingly, is it's kind of a shift in mindset around feedback, because beyond just looking at it for improvement and development, I think millennials also really see it as a way to like build trust and relationships with people, to build understanding. And then Gen Z also seems to view feedback kind of more as a collaborative thing. They're also actually more comfortable using technology for feedback. So you have all these like apps that are giving real-time feedback and all that stuff. Like that's something that they're much more accustomed to.
right.
And as a result, also prefer more frequent and immediate feedback. Obviously, that's actionable. Yeah. So those are some of the generalizations that are out there. And I think can also ring true. There's a reason why there are generalizations. Yeah.
It's very interesting what you say about different generations and their preferences, because that means that workforce is a mix of boomers, Gen X and Gen Z, and all of them together working in the same teams, but they have different preferences how to communicate, how to receive feedback. And those who are very comfortable using technology, for example, Gen Z, that is not suitable for boomers who prefer to have a face-to-face conversation, which means for a line manager, this needs to be taken into account, right? When working with a team with a mix of different generations.
Yeah,
which also means that a company need to adopt different ways of communicating and different allow infrastructure to be ready to facilitate this kind of conversations.
Yeah. I mean, yes and no, right? Because I do think fundamentally the fundamentals of feedback will remain the same across. The fundamentals of be respectful, make sure it's actionable, make sure it's specific, etc. That's the same across everyone. That's not going to change. No one's going to prefer like rude feedback. You know what I mean? The fundamentals will remain the same. Which is why actually I think first and foremost, the importance should still lie in actually just general feedback trainings. What is good feedback? What's not good feedback? What kind of feedback do we want to encourage in this organization, right? Beyond that, I will say that I think the best kind of feedback is always the kind of feedback that's personalized. And that's not just in terms of the content, but also in terms of the how it's given, right? So as a line manager, I think beyond adhering to what the company is anyways doing, you need to be clear on how each of your individual team members can best benefit from the feedback. How are they going to best receive it? And then do your best to try to accommodate to that.
Right. No, I totally agree with you. And I think when you are working in a company and you see that this company is serious about giving feedback and really invests in it and really appreciates this and facilitates these conversations, that's a good sign, because that means that this company is interested in your development, and you can definitely learn a lot. So basically, I would say my advice to people who are applying for jobs and who are trying to understand if it's a good match for them, this or that company, pay attention to the feedback culture that they have. What do they have in place? How are the processes set up? And in general, do they value this or not? And that will give you a good indication what kind of culture is in that company. So yeah.
I mean, let me ask you, right? Like, what's the best piece of feedback you've ever received?
The best piece of feedback, I would say, was the constructive feedback when I was, not delivering things that I was supposed to do, but I was not even 100% aware of it. Like that feedback was such an eye opener to me. It was uncomfortable. It was not nice to hear at the moment, but it made me think about it and made me pivot and improve. And I realized, okay, I need to here. This is where I need to step up. And it was a chance given to me. Okay, we can work on this, and it's going to be fine. And I realized that. So, okay, it's not good at this moment, but I can improve.
And who gave you that feedback?
My line manager.
And what kind of setting that they do that in?
It was just our weekly meeting.
Yeah, a one-on-one.
One-on-one. Yeah. I'm a total boomer, so yeah, I do one-on-one meetings.
Yeah, no, and I think that, see, like even just you were given that kind of feedback that was not easy to hear in a private setting. So I'm just going to add that on in terms of golden rules of feedback, especially if it's constructive. God, and you do still hear these like horrible, heartbreaking stories of people who received tough feedback in front of like the whole team, you know, like it was kind of a shout moment. And that is definitely not an appropriate setting to be giving that kind of feedback. So, you know, make sure you're in a private setting, it's one-on-one, and it feels safe and trusted. That's exactly, I think that was probably a huge part as to why you felt that constructive criticism or feedback now in hindsight was the most useful piece of feedback you ever received, because it was just between you and your manager. It was a trusted conversation, and the person followed up and helped you see what direction to move in, right? Those are all the things we've spoken about.
Yeah. And I think you've touched on a fundamentally important concept of trust. And I think that could also be one of the reasons why people are afraid to go into this feedback conversation, because they do not have trustful relationships with their managers, and they don't believe at heart that this will be helpful for them. So they become immediately defensive when they go into these conversations, which is a shame, because it is an opportunity to have a really good, open, constructive conversation. But indeed, you need to trust the person with whom you're going to have that. So that is also an important thing to think about, your relationship with your supervisor or your manager. Do you trust that person enough? Does he trust you or she? And can you have a really honest conversation about this?
Absolutely. And I think that's where it gets really tough. Okay. And I'm going to also refer now to more formal feedback conversations with your line manager, and under the assumption that you and your line manager don't have a good relationship, right? And that exists as well. And there's a lot of things that you can do to be as open-minded as you can in those conversations. But, you know, at the end of the day, feedback is a two-way dialogue. It's not all on your shoulders as the feedback receiver. And I think the only piece of advice I can give linked to that, beyond, still trying your best to, actively listening, making sure that you try to get as many examples as possible to see whether this is actually legitimate or not. The piece of advice I would give is try to find someone who is also more senior than you, who has access to your work and can see how you're working and what impact you're having, and go to them for an informal, formal feedback dialogue as well, to make sure that you have a second perspective. That can be helpful.
Right. That's a great advice. So don't be intimidated, and look for a second perspective on your performance. All right. And about this negative feedback, this is another question I had. So it's more or less clear that how to handle that within your team or with your line manager. But what about if you get negative feedback from your client? What do you do then? How do you handle this? This is completely different dynamics, relationships that you have. What would be your advice?
I don't actually think that there's so much that I would do differently in terms of my personal reaction. And so my advice would be, obviously, actively listen. They're your client. Make sure that you ask for concrete examples. Okay, could you please elaborate on when this happened? What exactly was it that set off this feedback, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And make sure you thank them for the feedback, and talk about, here's how we're going to be moving forward with this. Either I'll take this to my line manager. Would you prefer to pull someone else into this conversation with me? Is there anything that you would like specifically for me to do differently? Continue to involve them. Exactly like you would with your team. I don't think it's that different.
Right. It's just probably in your head, you might think that it's different because this is somebody external. But in fact, the process is the same. The mindset should also be the same. Yeah. And you just need to, indeed, at the end, come up with an action plan. What are you going to do to improve that and keep the client involved? Yeah.
That's right. But I will say, obviously, the one thing that probably is different when it's external is your follow-up from that feedback conversation, because you will definitely need to have a meeting with whoever is responsible for the project, or, even your line manager or one level up, to communicate that this feedback has been given, to make sure that you as a company continue to stand as a team and they also have your back. and that you together come up with a solution for the client. Always remember that you're not alone with feedback. A lot of people seem to think that when they've received negative feedback, that's something they now have to fully deal with themselves. I've actually found that when you share negative feedback that you have gotten with your teammates or with your peers or even with your line manager, and ask them for support on, look, I've received this, I'd like to change it. What from your perspective do you think I can do? And can you help me? When you go in with that approach, not only are you role modeling an excellent kind of feedback culture, you actually also are really only helping yourself develop faster, because you have people showing you every day, oh, you're doing it again. Or maybe try it this way, to help you change your behavioral patterns or the impact that you're having.
Right. That's really great advice. Well, I really have to say, have already quite a lot of experience of giving or receiving feedback, but even I've learned a few new things. And I hope that people who will listen to this podcast will also take away some useful insights. I would like to thank you, Eleana, for sharing your pearls of wisdom with us today.
No worries.
And I would love to make another podcast with you on another topic, as you are an assessment expert, so maybe we will do that. And in the meantime, I would like to invite everyone to connect with Eleana on LinkedIn and reach out to her if you need any coaching assistance in the future, or you have a feedback session coming up and you would like to prepare. Obviously, she is an expert who will help you to nail this conversation, and you will get great experience working with her. So thanks a lot, and wish everyone good luck, and till next time.
Thank you again.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.